Something was signed in Washington this week that the mainstream financial media is refusing to explain properly. And I don't think that's an accident. Because if the average retail investor actually understood what was buried inside this executive order, not the headline, not the press release, but the actual operational language, they would not be staring at red candles right now. They would be staring at the calendar. Let me ask you a brutal question. Why is it that on the exact same week Ripple formally submits its Federal Reserve Master Account application, the President of the United States signs a directive forcing the Fed, the SEC, the CFTC, the OCC, and the FDIC to rewrite the very rules that have been blocking firms exactly like Ripple for the past decade? The mainstream answer is coincidence. The honest answer is there are no coincidences at this altitude of finance. What you are watching is not a policy update. It is the controlled demolition of the wall that has separated digital assets from the U.S. payment rails, and the demolition order has a 90-day fuse. Let me pull back the curtain. Welcome back. On this channel, we don't trade in hype, we don't trade in price targets pulled from thin air, and we don't chase headlines. We decode the architecture beneath them. Today, we examine the executive order signed this week, the Fed Master Account question, the real-world asset tokenization explosion, now sitting at $33.8 billion, and why the institutional silence around all three is the loudest signal in the room. Before we go under the surface, this is analysis, not financial advice. Let's jump in. Let's start with the hard truth. 95% of people reading the headlines about this executive order are staring at the wrong word. They see crypto integration and they think it's another vague policy gesture, another working group, another study. It is not. To understand what was actually signed, you have to understand a system most retail investors have never heard of. It's called the Federal Reserve Master Account. A Fed Master Account is not a checking account. It is the highest tier access point to the U.S. dollar payment system itself. FedWire, the settlement layer. The pipes through which trillions of dollars move every single day between commercial banks, the Treasury, and the global financial network. If you do not have a master account, you do not touch those pipes directly. You rent access from someone who does, and you pay a premium, and you operate at their speed, and you live by their rules. For the entire history of cryptocurrency, no digital asset firm has ever been granted direct access to that system. Not one. The Fed has kept that door locked, and the SEC, the OCC, and the FDIC have stood guard around it. This executive order does something that, until this week, was considered politically impossible. It instructs the Federal Reserve to evaluate expanding direct access to its payment and account services for non-bank fintech firms, uninsured depository institutions, and this is the phrase that matters, digital asset firms. That is not a study. That is not a suggestion. That is a directive with a 90-day clock on it. You see, retail investors look at this and ask, when does the price move? But the silent actors, the custodians, the market makers, the sovereign treasuries, they look at this and ask a different question. They ask who is operationally ready on day one to plug into FedWire when that door opens. And there is exactly one publicly known digital asset company that has spent the last 6 years building the legal, technical, and licensing infrastructure to do precisely that. The same company that, by what we are told to call coincidence, filed its master account paperwork the same week this order was signed. This isn't a partnership announcement. This is the regulatory chess move that ends the game. Now let's do the math the retail crowd ignores. FedWire processes, and I want you to actually sit with this number, over $1.1 quadrillion in annualized settlement volume. Not billion, not trillion, quadrillion. That is the river that this executive order is preparing to open to digital asset rails. Layer on top of that the cross-border payments industry, which moves roughly $150 trillion annually. Layer on top of that the foreign exchange market at $7.5 trillion in daily turnover. And then layer on top of that the fastest growing instrument class in modern finance, tokenized real-world assets, which according to the latest distributed asset value data has hit $33.8 billion, representing a 1,600% expansion in 24 months. Now here's where the math gets interesting. XRP has a fixed total supply of 100 billion tokens. The circulating supply sits around 59 billion. A significant portion of the remainder is locked in escrow, released monthly, and the majority of those releases are routinely relocked. Effective liquid supply available to the open market is a fraction of the headline number. Now ask yourself the brutal question. If even 1/10 of 1% of FedWire's annualized flow, just $1.1 trillion out of $1.1 quadrillion, were to route through a bridge asset with a fixed cap and a shrinking liquid float, what does the math demand? This isn't a prediction, it's a requirement. Higher transactional throughput against a fixed supply forces one of two outcomes. Either the unit value of the bridge asset must rise to clear the volume with minimal slippage, or the network fails to settle. There is no third option. That is not a moonboy fantasy. That is the laws of physics and finance applied to a bridge currency. And here is what almost nobody is calculating correctly. At higher unit prices, the network becomes more efficient, not less. A $10 billion settlement at $3 per token requires moving 3.3 billion tokens through the order book. That is enormous slippage. At a meaningfully higher price, that same $10 billion settlement consumes a tiny fraction of the float. The system is mathematically designed to favor a higher unit price, because that is how institutional-grade settlement actually works. If you have a problem with this math, you don't have a problem with me. You have a problem with the design specification of a bridge asset operating at sovereign scale. While retail is doom-scrolling about a $1.1 billion ETF outflow last week, which, by the way, is statistically routine in any consolidation phase, the institutional signal has never been louder. Look at the evidence stack. Kevin Warsh has just been sworn in at the Federal Reserve, and his public record on digital settlement infrastructure is unambiguously constructive. Scott Bessent at Treasury has repeatedly framed digital assets as a strategic component of dollar dominance, not a threat to it. The leadership of the SEC, the OCC, and the CFTC has been deliberately reshaped over the last 12 months toward officials who have publicly stated that the Howey-era framework is incompatible with programmable settlement. Ask yourself this: does a trillion-dollar firm like BlackRock file for spot products, deepen its tokenization platform, and quietly expand its custody footprint without absolute confidence in the regulatory glide path? Does Franklin Templeton tokenize a money market fund without knowing exactly where the rails are going? Does JP Morgan publicly disclose partnership work with Ripple unless the legal certainty is already locked behind the scenes? These are not retail FOMO trades. These are calculated, multi-quarter positioning decisions made by entities that sign non-disclosure agreements the public will never see. And then there is the real-world asset tokenization curve. $33.8 billion in distributed asset value. 1,600% growth in 24 months. The most aggressive adoption curve I have ever seen for a new financial instrument category, steeper than ETFs in their first decade, steeper than mortgage-backed securities in the 1,980 seconds, steeper than the early days of the Eurodollar market. The infrastructure being built to tokenize treasuries, private credit, real estate, and commodities does not run on hope. It runs on a settlement layer. And the executive order signed this week is the document that tells the Federal Reserve to formally evaluate which settlement layers are eligible to plug directly into the dollar system. While the crowd is complaining about candles, the architects are pouring concrete. Now let me give you the actual timeline, because this is where the urgency becomes concrete. The executive order specifies two windows. The first is a 90-day mandated review covering the Federal Reserve, the SEC, the CFTC, the OCC, and the FDIC. They are required, not invited, required, to identify and report on every rule, every piece of guidance, every supervisory practice, and every licensing barrier that unduly impedes fintech and digital asset firms from partnering with traditional financial institutions and accessing the payment system. The second window is a 180-day broader policy review addressing the structural integration of digital assets into the traditional financial framework. What this means in operational terms is straightforward. Within roughly 3 months, we will see the first formal regulatory recommendations from the highest financial agencies in the United States, explicitly addressing master account access for digital asset firms. Within 6 months, we will see the structural framework for how those firms are absorbed into the payment system. And here is the catalyst the market has not yet priced. Once a digital asset firm receives direct Fed payment access, the risk premium that has suppressed institutional allocation evaporates instantly. The compliance officers at every major pension fund, every sovereign wealth fund, every insurance treasury, the people who have been sitting on the sidelines for years citing regulatory uncertainty, lose their last excuse. When that switch flips, the wait-and-see capital becomes the all-in capital. And it does not enter through the same door retail uses. It enters through OTC desks, through custodial allocations, through tokens that move directly from issuance to cold storage without ever touching a public order book. The fuse is lit. The countdown is 90 days for Phase 1, 180 days for Phase 2. That is not a vague horizon. That is a calendar. We are moving from an era of abundance to an era of scarcity, and most people will not realize it until the door has already closed behind them. Here is what scarcity actually looks like in practice. Exchange reserves for major digital assets have been bleeding for the better part of 2 years. Tokens are moving from public exchanges into institutional custody, into multi-signature cold storage, into escrow arrangements that are not designed to return supply to the open market. Once a token enters a sovereign-grade custody vault, it does not come back for a 10% profit. It is gone from the float, possibly for years, possibly forever. Now overlay that with the executive order. When the Fed formally opens master account access to digital asset firms, when the risk premium evaporates and pension funds begin allocating even single-digit percentages of their treasuries to programmable settlement assets, the demand-side shock hits a supply that has already been quietly drained. This is what the architects of this transition have been waiting for. The institutions did not spend years pushing for regulatory clarity out of charity. They pushed for it because clarity is the gate that allows them to deploy capital at scale. And they have spent the entire intervening period accumulating, positioning, and building infrastructure while the retail crowd has been busy being shaken out by every red candle and every fear-driven headline. Once the final switch is flipped, the retail market will not be priced out by a marketing campaign. It will be priced out by arithmetic. You will look at the order book and realize that the tokens you could have bought whole, you will now be buying in fractions. That is not hyperbole. That is what happens when fixed supply meets institutional scale demand under a regulatory green light. The institutions have spent years engineering exactly this setup. The conditions for the great priced out are no longer theoretical. They are scheduled. I know it has been a difficult stretch. I know that watching $1.1 billion in ETF outflows in a single week, watching oil volatility, watching the macro noise, I know it tests conviction. That is the entire point of this phase. But as an analyst, I am trained to distinguish between noise and signal. The noise is the weekly outflow number. The signal is an executive order that mandates the rewriting of every rule that has kept digital assets out of the U.S. payment system for the last 15 years. The noise is the red candle. The signal is the master account application filed the same week the order was signed. The noise is the headline that says crypto in correction. The signal is $33.8 billion in tokenized real-world assets, growing at 1,600% over 24 months, while the regulatory architecture is being rebuilt to absorb that growth into the traditional system. Being early feels exactly like being wrong, right up until the moment reality catches up. And the people who understand the difference between those two experiences are the people who are still holding when the new floor is established. The question is not whether the integration happens. The executive order makes the integration a regulatory obligation. The question is who is still positioned when the 90-day clock runs out and the 180-day clock follows it. Let me leave you with this. The price of digital assets today is a distraction. The structural integration of digital assets into the U.S. payment system is the reality. One is a candle on a chart. The other is the rewiring of how the dollar itself settles. If you understand what was actually signed this week, not the press release, not the headline, but the operational language directing the Federal Reserve to evaluate direct payment access for digital asset firms within 90 days, then you understand that the next 2 quarters are not about price action. They are about positioning before the architecture goes live. The market rewards composure in moments like this. It does not reward panic, and it does not reward distraction. It rewards the people who can read a directive, count the days on the calendar, and stay where they are. If you made it to the end of this analysis, drop the words 90-day fuse in the comments. I want to see who is actually reading the order and who is just reading the headlines. And if this kind of deep structural breakdown is what you came here for, subscribe, because the next 180 days are going to produce more analyzable signal than the last 3 years combined. In a market fueled by emotion and noise, we thrive on data and composure. Stay patient, stay rational. The math doesn't lie and the system is almost complete. I'll see you in the next briefing.